In the spring of 2000, a young farmer walked the edge of a muddy field in West Sussex and did something he had never done before. He stopped. He looked at the cracked soil, the thin wheat struggling to stand, and the rusted drainage pipes poking from the earth like broken bones. And for the first time in his life, he asked himself a question that felt almost forbidden. What if this land was never supposed to be a farm at all? His name was Charlie Burrell. His family had worked this ground for over 200 years. His father had farmed it, his grandfather had farmed it, and every generation before them had bent their backs against the same cold, heavy clay, pulling crops from soil that never wanted to give them. But by the time Charlie inherited the estate, the numbers told a story that pride could no longer hide. The farm was dying. Not slowly, not gently, but in a slow bleed of red ink that no amount of effort could stop. The problem was the clay itself. This was not the rich, dark soil of the English breadbasket counties. This was West Sussex clay, cold and wet, the kind that sticks to your boots and holds water like a sponge. Crops grew slowly here. Yields stayed stubbornly below the national average, and every year the gap between what the farm earned and what it cost to run it grew a little wider. Charlie had tried everything his father and grandfather had tried: new machinery, new seeds, more fertilizer, more drainage, but the land would not bend. It simply was not built for industrial farming. By the year 2000, the estate owed more money than it could ever hope to pay back through crops alone. The bank was circling, the neighbours whispered, and Charlie Burrell stood at a crossroads that faces thousands of struggling farmers every year, but almost none of them choose the path he took next. He decided to stop fighting the land. He decided to let go. Now, to understand how radical that decision was, you have to understand what English land is supposed to do. In Britain, land works. It earns. It produces. A field that sits empty is a failure. A hedge that grows wild is neglect. The entire culture of the countryside is built on the idea that good land is managed land, and managed land means controlled land. Every fence, every ditch, every trimmed hedge and ploughed field is a statement of human order imposed on nature. To suggest that land might be better off without that control is, in farming circles, close to heresy. But Charlie had stumbled across an idea that made him question everything he had been taught. It came from a Dutch scientist named Frans Vera, a man who had spent years studying the ancient pollen records and beetle remains buried in European soil. And what Vera had found challenged the most basic assumption about what Europe looked like before humans took over. The textbook story goes like this. Before farming, Europe was one vast, dark forest. Remove the humans and the trees come back. End of story. But Vera said the evidence told a different tale. He argued that prehistoric Europe was not a wall of trees at all. It was a patchwork. Open grassland here, dense thicket there, scattered woodland broken by clearings and glades. And the force that kept it that way was not fire or flood. It was animals. Enormous herbivores once roamed the continent in numbers we can barely imagine today. Wild cattle called aurochs, standing nearly as tall as a man at the shoulder. Herds of wild horses. Elk with antlers spanning 6 feet. Boar rooting through the forest floor. Deer of half a dozen species. And before them, even larger beasts that have long since vanished. These animals did not simply live in the landscape, they built it. They grazed the grass, they stripped the bark from trees, they trampled paths through the undergrowth, they punched holes in the canopy and kept clearings open for centuries at a time. The result was a shifting mosaic of habitats, always changing, never uniform, driven not by human design, but by the movements and appetite of wild animals. This was the vision that changed Charlie Burrell's mind. What if the land at Knepp was not failing because it was bad farmland? What if it was failing because farming itself was the wrong question to ask of it? What if, instead of forcing the clay to grow wheat, He let the animals shape it the way they had done for hundreds of thousands of years before the first plough ever cut the soil. It was a wild idea. Nobody in Britain had tried it at this scale. The scientific community was divided on whether Vera's theory was even correct, and the practical challenges were enormous. But Charlie had one advantage that gave him the freedom to take the risk. He had nothing left to lose. In 2001, he and his wife Isabella Tree made their decision. They would stop farming. They would remove the internal fences that divided the estate into neat fields. They would break up the old Victorian drainage pipes that had spent a century sucking water off the land. And they would turn animals loose, not to produce meat or milk on a schedule, but simply to roam, to graze, to root, to trample, and to do whatever their instincts told them to do. Then they would step back and see what happened. The neighbours thought they had lost their minds. Choosing the right animals was the first puzzle. Charlie and Isabella were not trying to recreate a prehistoric theme park. They were not pretending they could bring back the aurochs or the tarpan. Those animals were gone forever. But they could find modern breeds that behaved in similar ways. Hardy animals that knew how to survive on rough land without human help. They started with Old English Longhorn cattle. These were not the sleek dairy cows of modern farming. They were stocky, thick-skinned beasts with long, curved horns, animals that could browse on thorny scrub and thrive in conditions that would break a Holstein. Unlike factory cattle, they did not need lush pasture. They wandered, they grazed selectively, and they left much of the vegetation untouched, creating a patchwork of long and short grass wherever they went. Next came the Exmoor ponies, one of the oldest and wildest breeds in Britain. These small, sturdy horses had roamed the moors of Devon for thousands of years. They were the closest living relatives of the wild horses that once shaped prehistoric Europe. At Knepp, they would do what ponies do best. They would push into dense scrub that cattle avoided. They would strip back the brambles and blackthorn. They would create paths and openings in vegetation that other animals could not penetrate. Then the pigs arrived. Tamworth pigs, long-snouted and semi-feral, with a temperament closer to wild boar than to the pink factory pigs of modern agriculture. In England, you cannot legally release wild boar, but Tamworths behave almost the same way. They root, they dig, they turn the soil with their snouts, churning up the ground and leaving bare patches of earth wherever they go. Those patches, Charlie hoped, would be colonised by pioneer plants and insects, the first links in a chain of life that industrial farming had broken. Finally, several species of deer were allowed to roam freely. Fallow deer and roe deer, red deer in smaller numbers, drifting through the emerging landscape and preventing any one type of vegetation from taking over. Together, the animals formed a kind of living toolkit, each species doing a different job, and all of them working without a plan. The first year was chaos. The neat fields dissolved into a tangle of weeds. The neighbours complained about thorns and thistles drifting across the boundary. The drainage ditches filled with water and overflowed into the fields. The cattle wandered where they pleased, ignoring the invisible lines that had once divided the estate into productive blocks. To anyone who judged land by its tidiness, Knepp looked like a disaster. But Charlie and Isabella held their nerve. They had committed to a 20-year experiment. They would not judge it by the first season. By the 5th year, something strange began to happen. The land started to sort itself out. Not into neat fields, not into anything a farmer would recognise, but into a patchwork of habitats unlike anything southern England had seen in living memory. Scrub and bramble sprawled across some areas. Open grassland held on in others. Young trees pushed up through the thickets, protected from grazing deer by the thorns that surrounded them. And in the low-lying grounds, water returned. Ponds formed where the broken drainage could no longer carry the rain away. Reed beds appeared. Willows took root along the edges. The pigs, it turned out, were doing something remarkable. Every time they rooted through the soil, they created a bare patch of earth. Those patches were immediately colonized by annual wildflowers, seeds that had lain dormant in the ground for decades, waiting for the disturbance that farming had denied them. The following year, perennial plants moved in, then scrub, then young trees. But before the trees could close the canopy, the pigs would return and tear up a new patch, resetting the clock and keeping the mosaic shifting. It was a cycle that no human manager could have maintained, but the pigs did it for free, simply by following their instincts. The cattle and ponies created their own patterns. They grazed certain areas short and avoided others entirely. The result was a landscape of wildly different heights, from ankle-high turf to head-high thicket, all mixed together in a way that no mowing schedule could ever replicate. Ecologists have a word for this kind of variety. They call it structural heterogeneity. But you do not need the jargon to understand what it means. It means hiding places and hunting grounds, nesting sites and feeding stations, shelter from the wind and exposure to the sun. In short, it means homes, thousands of them, for thousands of different species. And the species noticed. The first signs came from the birds. Skylarks, which had been declining for decades on English farmland, began to breed in the rough grassland. Woodlarks appeared, a bird so rare in Sussex that its return made local news. Yellowhammers sang from the scrub. Whitethroats nested in the brambles. And then the nightingales arrived. The nightingale is one of the most celebrated birds in English literature, but it is also one of the most troubled. Its numbers have crashed by 90% since the 1960s. It depends on dense, thorny scrub for nesting, exactly the kind of habitat that modern farming eliminates. At Knepp, where blackthorn and hawthorn were now free to sprawl across hundreds of acres, the nightingales found what they had been missing. From a single territory in the early years, the population exploded. By the 2020s, more than 60 singing males held territories on the estate. In a country where the bird is vanishing, Knepp had become one of its last strongholds. The turtle dove told an even more dramatic story. This gentle, purring bird has declined by more than 98% in Britain. Across almost the entire country, it is functionally extinct as a breeding species. The causes are complex, involving hunting in the Mediterranean, changes in farming, and loss of the weed seeds the doves depend on. But at Knepp, the turtle doves found something they could not find almost anywhere else. They found thick hedgerows and weedy margins. They found seeds from plants that modern herbicides had wiped out elsewhere, and they began to breed. By the mid-2020s, Knepp was one of the only places in Britain where the turtle dove population was actually rising. The bird that symbolises peace and gentleness, the bird that has crashed so far that most conservationists consider it effectively lost, was clinging on in the messy, unmanaged tangles of a rewilded estate. It was not a miracle. It was simply what happened when the habitat came back. The insects arrived next, and they arrived in numbers that stunned even the scientists who came to count them. The purple emperor is a large, shimmering butterfly that most British naturalists consider the holy grail of their hobby. It is secretive, canopy-dwelling, and famously difficult to see. Its caterpillars feed on sallow, a type of willow that grows in damp, scrubby places, exactly the kind of habitats that modern land management removes. At Knepp, sallow had exploded along the wet margins and in the thickets that nobody was clearing, and the purple emperors followed. By 2019, surveyors counted nearly 300 individuals in a single day. Knepp had become one of the largest colonies of purple emperors in the entire country, a butterfly that most people never see in their lifetimes, appearing in clouds above the oaks. The estate was not planted with sallow. Nobody had drawn up a plan to attract the butterfly. The animals had created the conditions, and the butterfly had found them. Dragonflies and damselflies told a similar story. When the drainage was broken, water returned to the land in ways nobody had predicted. Ponds formed in old ditches. Wet flushes appeared in low-lying pasture, and the insects that depend on water, species that had vanished from the area decades ago, came back in astonishing numbers. One survey recorded an increase of over 800% compared to the surrounding farmland. 800%. Not because anyone had dug ponds or planted reeds, but because the land had been allowed to find its own wet places again. Beetles followed the same pattern. The stag beetle, Britain's largest, depends on rotting wood buried underground. Modern forestry clears dead trees. Knepp left them standing. The beetles returned. Rare longhorn beetles, click beetles, and dozens of other species tied to decaying timber appeared in surveys that had recorded nothing for decades. The tangled, messy landscape that would horrify any tidy landowner turned out to be exactly what a vanishing fauna had been waiting for. But the story that captured the public imagination more than any other involved a bird that had not bred in Britain for more than 500 years. The white stork is a tall, elegant bird with black-tipped wings and a long red bill. Across much of Europe, it is a common sight, nesting on rooftops and chimneys, striding through wet meadows in search of frogs and fish. But in Britain, it vanished centuries ago. The last recorded nesting was in the year 1416 on a rooftop somewhere in England. For 600 years after that, the white stork was nothing more than a rare visitor, a bird occasionally glimpsed passing through on migration, but never staying to breed. In 2016, Charlie and Isabella joined a project to bring the storks back. The plan was simple but audacious. They would release a group of captive bred storks at Knepp, birds that had been raised in Poland and hand-reared to tolerate humans. These birds would act as a social anchor, a visible population that might attract wild migrating storks to stop and investigate rather than flying straight over. For 3 years, the released storks stayed close to home, learning the landscape, finding food, and building nests in the tall oaks. And then, in the spring of 2020, the breakthrough came. A pair of wild storks, birds that had arrived on their own from somewhere on the continent, nested and laid eggs at Knepp. The chicks hatched successfully. For the first time since the Wars of the Roses, white storks were breeding in Britain. The news spread fast. Birdwatchers came from across the country to see the gangly chicks peering over the edge of their nest. Cameras were set up to live stream the feeding sessions. And in the summers that followed, more pairs nested, more chicks fledged, and some of those young storks made the long journey south to Africa and back again, completing a migratory cycle that had been broken for 6 centuries. There is a village just south of Knepp, whose name comes from an old Saxon phrase meaning roughly, the place of the storks. For hundreds of years, that name made no sense. The storks were gone. Only the word remained, a fossil buried in the language. Now, for the first time since the Middle Ages, people in that village can watch white storks circling above the trees and know that the name on their signposts finally matches the birds in their sky. The data piled up year after year. Independent surveys confirmed that breeding birds had increased 9-fold across the estate. Bats flourished, small mammals returned. The soil itself began to change. Studies found that the rewilded land was now storing carbon at rates comparable to native woodland, locking away greenhouse gases that the old farmland had released. Organic matter in the soil climbed measurably in just 2 decades. Microbial life, the invisible foundation of healthy ground, was dramatically higher than on the surrounding farms. And here is the part that surprised almost everyone, including Charlie and Isabella themselves. Knepp was making money. Not charity money, not grant money, real income from real markets, generated by a landscape that conventional wisdom said should have been worthless. The free-roaming herds produced meat. Not factory meat, not feedlot beef, but wild-range, pasture-fed meat from animals that had lived their entire lives outdoors, eating what they chose, moving where they pleased. That meat commanded premium prices. Restaurants and butchers queued up to buy it. The brand became a symbol of a different kind of farming, one that worked with the land instead of against it. Tourism followed. Tens of thousands of visitors came each year to walk the trails, stay in the safari-style campsites, and join guided wildlife safaris across the estate. In a country where nature tourism was growing faster than almost any other sector, Knepp had something nobody else could offer. It had wildness. It had nightingales singing at dusk, and purple emperors drifting through the canopy, and white storks circling overhead. People paid for that experience, and they told their friends. Then came the biodiversity credits. Under new environmental rules, developers in England were required to offset the damage they caused to wildlife by funding habitat restoration elsewhere. Knepp could sell that restoration. Companies building houses or roads could pay the estate to continue rewilding, and the credits they purchased could count against their legal obligations. It was a new market, still finding its feet, but it represented a profound shift in how society valued land. For the first time, letting nature recover was not just ethically right, it was financially rewarded. Carbon payments added another stream. The soil at Knepp was locking away carbon that industrial farms released. As carbon markets matured, that storage became something companies would pay for. The land that had once bled money under wheat and dairy was now earning it by simply being allowed to heal. Employment rose too. The old farm had needed only a handful of workers, mostly running machinery. The rewilded estate employed more people in more varied roles: ecologists and rangers, butchers and chefs, tour guides and educators, fencing contractors and wildlife monitors. The local economy gained jobs that had not existed before, and the estate became a hub for a growing community of people who wanted to work with nature rather than against it. By the mid-2020s, Knepp had become something nobody had predicted when Charlie Burrell stood in that muddy field 25 years earlier. It had become a model. Farmers from across Britain came to visit. Policymakers studied its results. Environmental groups pointed to its data as proof that large-scale rewilding could work in a densely populated country. And scientists used its surveys to test theories about how ecosystems recover when the pressure comes off. The most important lesson may be the simplest one. Knepp did not succeed because anyone knew exactly what would happen. It succeeded because nobody tried to control what would happen. The animals were given freedom, the land was given time, and the combination produced a result that no plan could have predicted. A thriving ecosystem built not by human design, but by the same forces that shaped Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before the first farm was ever cleared. There is a phrase that Isabella Tree uses when she talks about the project. She calls it letting go. It sounds passive, almost weak, but anyone who has spent time at Knepp knows that letting go is one of the hardest things a landowner can do. It means tolerating mess. It means watching brambles swallow your fields and thorns scratch your car, and visitors complain about the mud. It means trusting a process you cannot see and accepting results you cannot predict. It means humility. But it also means something else. It means recognizing that the land does not need us to tell it what to be. Given the chance, given the animals, given the water and the time, the land will become what it was always meant to become. Not a factory, not a machine, but a living, breathing, constantly shifting home for more life than we can count. 25 years ago, Charlie Burrell looked at a failing farm and asked what it would do if he stopped fighting it. The answer, it turns out, was everything.